sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
All right, so let's dive into something that I think has probably shaken up your week. Literally. We're talking about the recent earthquake in New Jersey.
Oh, yeah.
And, you've sent us some interesting material on this, including a news piece from FOX5 New York. And we're going to explore today kind of why on earth New Jersey had an earthquake. What are these aftershocks that everyone's talking about? And should we be bracing ourselves for more tremors in the future?
It is a bit unusual, isn't it?
Yeah.
Most folks think of California when it comes to earthquakes, not the Garden State.
Exactly. So let's break this down. The news article mentions a 2.4 magnitude earthquake hitting Bergen County on January 24th, 2025.
Okay.
Which is not exactly, San Andreas's level, but still.
Yeah.
An earthquake in New Jersey, I feel like the ground there should be a bit more stable.
Well, you see, the reason earthquakes are less common on the East Coast is because of plate tectonics. The West Coast, it's right on the edge of a tectonic plate where it meets the Pacific plate. And that constant grinding and shifting is what causes those massive earthquakes you see in movies. The East Coast, on the other hand, is smack dab in the middle of the North American plate. So we're far away from those active boundaries.
Okay. So those dramatic shifts are much less likely to happen.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But then how do we explain this earthquake in New Jersey?
Well, that's where the Ramapo fault line comes into play.
Yeah.
Remember that 4.8 magnitude earthquake that shook NYC back in April 2024?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, that event really brought this fault line into the spotlight.
Wait, a fault line runs through New Jersey? I swear I'm learning more about geology today than I did in all of high school.
It's actually the largest fault system
Yeah.
in the northeastern U.S., running right through parts of New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania.
Whoa.
It's not as active as those plate boundaries out west, but it can still cause some shaking from time to time. The FOX5 piece actually has a video about it.
Wow.
That 2024 quake, researchers even discovered a whole new fault line during that event. Because the shaking was so atypical.
Wow, so we've got this hidden network of cracks under our feet, just waiting to shake things up. That's a little unsettling, to be honest.
Yeah.
So this Ramapo fault line, how does it actually cause earthquakes? Is it like those tectonic plates just on a smaller scale?
You got it. Think of it like this. Even though we're in the middle of the plate, it's not one solid, unbroken piece.
Okay.
It's got these cracks, these faults that are under constant stress. And every now and then that stress builds up, and the rock along the fault slips or shifts to release that pressure. And that sudden movement is what causes the ground to shake the earthquake.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now. It's like bending a stick until it finally snaps.
Right.
But what about aftershocks? That seems to be the buzzword everyone's throwing around. Are those just mini earthquakes happening? Because the fault line is still settling?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Imagine that stick snapping. There might be some smaller cracking and popping sounds afterward, right?
Okay.
Aftershocks are those smaller tremors. That happen as the ground around the fault continues to adjust. After the main earthquake,
So those aftershocks, they could go on for a while. Like, how long are we talking here?
it really varies. Sometimes it's just hours, but they can continue for days, weeks, even years
Wow.
after the initial quake. It all depends on how much the fault shifted
Yeah.
and how much energy was released. It's basically the earth catching its breath, so to speak, after a big shakeup.
That actually reminds me of a time when I was...
It's fascinating how our personal experiences can connect to these larger natural events.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about your experience. But before we get sidetracked, let's shift our focus to something a bit more
Okay.
metropolitan. This recent earthquake, even though it's small, brings up a big question about New York City's vulnerability to earthquakes.
That's a good point. We've got millions of people living in a relatively small area. A lot of those iconic skyscrapers weren't exactly built with earthquakes in mind.
Exactly. A major earthquake in New York City could have a devastating impact. Think about the infrastructure.
Right.
Bridges, tunnels,
Yeah.
subways, not to mention the buildings themselves. It's a complex web that could be easily disrupted, even with a moderate quake.
Okay, now I'm officially a little freaked out. So if we want to keep tabs on all this seismic activity, what resources are out there? You mentioned something about a USGS earthquake map, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
USGS, or the United States Geological Survey, has an incredible interactive map that shows real-time earthquake activity all over the world.
Wow. Okay.
Great way to visualize just how active our planet really is. You can zoom in on specific regions, see the magnitude of recent earthquakes. and even track aftershocks. It's a bit humbling, to be honest.
I bet it is. I'll have to check that out after this. Talking about all this reminds me of something I read a while back about how they discovered a new fault line after that 2024 earthquake in New York. Something about the shaking being different than what they expected.
Yes, that's a perfect example of how much we're still learning about the earth beneath our feet. That 2024 earthquake was a bit of an anomaly because the shaking was felt much farther away than anticipated. It turns out there was a previously undetected fault line that contributed to the widespread tremors. And the more we learn about these hidden faults, the better we can understand the potential risks and prepare for future events.
It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, right? We keep finding these missing pieces and trying to fit them into the bigger picture. What I find fascinating is that even though we live on this incredibly dynamic, ever-changing planet, it's easy to forget about those forces at play until something like this earthquake happens. We kind of go about our daily lives, assuming the ground beneath us is solid and stable.
I think that's human nature, isn't it? We tend to focus on the immediate and the familiar.
Right.
But events like this serve as a powerful reminder that we're part of something much larger and more complex than ourselves. And that understanding that awareness can be both humbling and empowering.
I like that. Empowering. So for our listeners who might be feeling a bit uneasy after hearing all this, what are some practical things they can do to feel more prepared for a potential earthquake?
That's a great question. First and foremost, knowledge is power.
Okay.
The more you understand about earthquakes and the risks in your area, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions. Check out that USGS earthquake map, learn about the fault lines in your region, and understand the basics of earthquake safety. It's also crucial to have a plan.
Okay.
Talk to your family or housemates about what you would do during an earthquake. Identify safe places in your home, and have an emergency kit ready with essentials like water, non-perishable food, a first aid kit, and a flashlight.
It's funny, we practice fire drills all the time, but earthquake drills, not so much. Maybe that's something we should all start doing.
You're absolutely right. It's about shifting our mindset and incorporating these types of preparedness measures into our daily lives. It doesn't have to be overwhelming or anxiety-inducing, just small practical steps that can make a big difference. In the event of an earthquake.
So what about during the earthquake itself? What should people do if they feel the ground shaking?
The key is to stay calm and protect yourself. If you're indoors, drop, cover, and hold on is the mantra.
Okay.
Drop to the ground. Take cover under a sturdy piece of furniture like a desk or table, and hold on until the shaking stops. If you're outdoors, move away from buildings, trees, and power lines, anything that could fall and cause injury.
Right.
And once the shaking stops, be aware of your surroundings and check for any hazards like broken glass or down to power lines.
So it's all about having a plan, staying calm, and knowing what to do in the moment.
Exactly. And remember, even though earthquakes might be less common on the East Coast, they are a possibility.
Yeah.
We can't control nature, but we can control how we prepare and respond.
That's a great point. I think sometimes we can get complacent when we live in areas that aren't known for certain natural disasters, but it's important to remember that nature can be unpredictable, and it's always best to be prepared for anything.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like that saying, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Exactly. And speaking of preparedness, I think this deep dive has highlighted a crucial point. Okay, go on. Well, we often hear about earthquake preparedness in California, but what about the East Coast? Should we be rethinking building codes and infrastructure, especially in densely populated areas like New York City?
That's an interesting point. If we know that earthquakes, although less frequent, are still a possibility on the East Coast, shouldn't our buildings and infrastructure reflect that?
Precisely. It's a complex issue with a lot of factors to consider, but it's definitely a conversation worth having, especially in light of these recent events.
All right, so if I'm getting this right, the key takeaway here is that even though earthquakes might not be as common on the East Coast, they're not impossible. And being prepared, having a plan, knowing what to do during an earthquake, and even considering the bigger picture of infrastructure and preparedness is crucial.
That's a fantastic summary. And remember, the USGS earthquake map is a great resource for anyone who wants to stay informed about earthquake activity around the world.
Right. Checking out that map can really put things into perspective. So we've covered a lot of ground today, from the specifics of the recent earthquake in New Jersey to the broader implications of earthquake preparedness on the East Coast. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with today?
Just this. This deep dive was sparked by a relatively small earthquake in New Jersey, but it's prompted us to think about the bigger picture. What about your area? Have you considered the risks and how you would prepare for an earthquake? It's never too early to start thinking about these things.
That's a great point to end on. We've given you a lot to consider today, but we'll leave you with one final question. Even though earthquakes are less common on the East Coast, should we be rethinking building codes and infrastructure, especially in places like New York City? Food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of earthquakes. Until next time, stay curious.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're bubbly.